Welcome back into the Lions247 Podcast. I am Tyler Donohue, and we are happy to be back with a bunch ahead of this matchup between the Indiana Hoosiers and the Penn State Nittany Lions. The number 15 Nittany Lions now as they come out with the college football playoff rankings. We were on the practice field on Wednesday. We'll have some conversation about that with Mark Brennan and Daniel Gallen. Of course, we are watching the quarterback position very closely right now with Penn State as James Franklin has been non-committal about who will start this matchup, which is pretty new territory, as we'll cover ground with a little bit later here on the episode. And as we've discussed a lot this week on the Lions247 Podcast, offensive line situation needs to be sorted through, some missing pieces to that puzzle on the practice field Wednesday. We'll give you our thoughts on players to watch, general takeaways from this matchup, and give our final predictions, including some bold ones as well, as bold as it gets on this show. But right now we begin with focus on the Hoosiers, who come into this riding a 5-game losing streak at 3-5. Matt Weaver joins us. He covers Indiana for 24/7 Sports. And Matthew, we're really happy to have you with us. Thanks for joining us on the game week.
Oh, thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
Well, let's begin with the obvious. Indiana, 5 losses in a row following that 3-0 start. What went right early? What has gone wrong since then?
Well, I mean, early on, obviously the schedule's gotten harder. The competition's got better. And obviously they start with Illinois, and Illinois is having a great season, arguably the best team over in the West. They had some breaks. Illinois, that game turned it over 4 times. Second week you played Idaho. They actually were up on Indiana 10-0 and then couldn't sustain it. And then third game, Western Kentucky had a game-winning field goal literally as time was running out and missed it and went into overtime, and Indiana was able to take it overtime. The offense has not been great all season, but it was better in those first early games. And I think part of it, I kind of addressed it in your questions, the question exchange we did. They have a new offensive coordinator, Walt Bell, and I think teams, there wasn't a lot of film on them. And I think teams have started, there's more film now. They're starting to adjust. And then the issues that Indiana had in the first 3 games that were kind of covered up because they got some breaks, because they did make some things happen, give them credit for that. They're not getting those same breaks now. So those issues are really, really coming to the surface even more. So offensively, they're just not playing very good. I mean, Nebraska is not great defensively. They couldn't do hardly anything against them. They go to Rutgers, they get a kickoff return for a touchdown, get a drive for a touchdown, then they don't score for basically 3.5 quarters. It's just a struggle offensively. And then defensively, they're okay, but they're on the field a lot. Indiana's dead last in time of possession because they play fast and they're getting a lot of 3-and-outs. So the defense is on the field a ton. They're getting worn out as the game goes along. And, they're not playing to the level I think people thought. The secondary has not been great, which everybody thought would be a strength. Linebackers have been good, even with the loss of Cam Jones. The D-line's been so-so. But, it's just kind of like I say in my exchange, it's at best a mediocre team. And quite honestly, they're just not very good.
Yeah, Matt and I exchanged some questions for content purposes, text-wise, up on our respective sites, so you can check those out as well. Of course, we're going to cover a lot of ground right here. And at quarterback, it's a spot we've been focused on here at the Penn State beat throughout this week. We're trying to see what that's going to look like come kickoff Saturday. What can you tell us about that position for the Hoosiers right now?
Well, this is the first week. Every week we've gotten Connor Bazelak on Monday, the Monday weekday press conference or game week press conference. Did not get him this week. Coach Allen was asked about the quarterback position because Bazelak has struggled. I mean, he's made some bad throws, had some bad turnovers, and he was non-committal, kind of like I heard you say about James Franklin. He was non-committal. Indiana's real big about hiding stuff. It's interesting that you guys get to go to practice. We haven't been to a practice since the middle of August. We see nothing. So we don't know what's going on the practice field, who's playing where, what the depth chart looks like. And he was non-committal. I mean, it sounds to me like there's going to be somebody else under center, whether that's because of performance or Bazelak has taken a beating. He has really been hit a lot this year. There's been some games where it's taken him a little while to get up off the turf, and he's kind of limped off a few times, but he's always played. He's been the only quarterback, I think he's taken every single snap. He's been the only quarterback out there. So you just kind of expect him to be the starter. So it sounds like there's something up. I don't know if, like I said, if it's performance-based or injury or maybe a little bit of both. And I'm not saying there will be a new quarterback, but it certainly sounds like that's going to be the case because, like I said, Allen said Monday, you're going to have to wait and see on Saturday who our quarterback is, and that's something they've not done since the season started.
Bazelak at 55% completion, 12 touchdowns, 9 interceptions on the season, just over 2,000 yards as well. I know Sean Shivers has gotten a lot of work. He's over 100 carries on the season, just under 4 yards per touch. You talked about the offensive line maybe contributing to the fact that the quarterback has taken that beating. Is this an Indiana team that has struggled to assert itself in the run game as well?
Yeah, and they fired Darren Hiller. I think it was after the Michigan game. It was a couple weeks ago, the week before Maryland. So a few weeks ago, the offensive line coach, and it was something that fans had kind of been clamoring for a while. The offensive line was bad last year. It had not really improved. Rod Carey, who's the former Northern Illinois and Temple coach, played here at Indiana. Was an offensive lineman, and that's his background. He was actually, after getting let go at Temple last year, he came to Indiana as one of those, I don't know, quality control or consultants or whatever they call him nowadays. And they just kind of bumped him up to that offensive line job. And I think they've improved, but it's really hard to make improvements midstream. I mean, once you start the season, you kind of are what you are. There's just not enough time to really work out the kinks and fix something that's broken. You can maybe make it a little bit better, but it's honestly, you're putting a Band-Aid on a gunshot wound for the most part. And they have looked a little bit better, but this is something that's going to take an off season and a spring ball to get fixed. But yeah, they don't run the ball. And then you've got a quarterback in Bazelak who is not mobile. He's not, once this rush gets to him, he's either throwing it away or he's going down for a sack. He's not going to make plays with his legs. So that's hurt him as well. And so that's why it'll be interesting if they do make a change this week. Dexter Williams, who's third on the depth chart, but probably is the most talented guy in the roster. He's a dual threat kid out of Georgia. He's never not played it down, but he has he can run and throw. So it might be interesting to see if maybe they go that route. I don't know if they will. Jack Tuttle's the other choice, but he announced 2 weeks ago he's going in the portal, and he's got 4 games left in his career. He's staying with the team, which is an unusual situation. I find it would be weird to me if you start a guy who's got 4 games in his career and has basically said, I don't want to be here anymore. But this is Indiana, so I guess anything's possible.
We got weird stuff to talk about at quarterback this week on both sides.
Yeah.
I'm telling you, man, it's an interesting conversation on both campuses right now. A couple Cams, it would seem, are going to be out of action here. Cam Camper confirmed out for the season now. He has led the way for Indiana, almost 600 receiving yards. That pretty much doubles up anybody else on the roster in terms of production. And then Cam Jones, who's a guy that we've gotten pretty accustomed to in this series. He's been a highly productive linebacker for the Hoosiers. Can we spotlight the impact of both those players being off the field? I don't think it's been confirmed all the way with Cam Jones, but based on the reporting I've seen on your site, it certainly doesn't indicate that it's an optimistic outlook for his availability this Saturday.
Yeah, my guess, if I was going to put money on it, I don't think Cam Jones plays. They said several weeks, and there were some rumors that it could be almost the entire season. I think if he does come back, you're probably talking the last game or two. I think honestly, Cam Camper's the bigger loss though, because Aaron Casey has moved over. He was starting at he was starting one linebacker. They moved him over and put Bradley Jennings in at the middle spot where Casey was. And Aaron Casey, while he's not Cam Jones, has been really productive. He's played well. It's not the same level, but I think they've made up for that lost production with Cam Jones. Cam Camper by far is the best receiver on this team. It's not even close. When he didn't play against Nebraska, and it really showed. I'm not saying they beat Nebraska, but I think it would have been more competitive, at least in the second half, where they just couldn't move the ball. So losing Cam Camper is a major blow. DJ Matthews has been, since Cincinnati, has basically been banged up with a hamstring issue, and some of the other guys just have not stepped up. So Camper is really a significant loss for this team, and it's why like I said, I have no idea who they're going to start, but maybe you go to more of the dual threat quarterback so you can try to, maybe you can't change your scheme, but maybe try to attack in a different way a little bit, because this was a passing offense. This was about Bazelak dropping back and throwing it a ton and getting the ball out quick and playing fast. And now if Bazelak's not playing, you don't have Camper. It's really 2 big pieces of the puzzle, and I don't know how you overcome that.
They've got some transfer pieces at receiver. We know Emery Simmons' name around here. DJ Matthews is a guy who started elsewhere. If they're able to attack Penn State, get some guys in space, who are the playmakers that Indiana may not take 15, 20 touches on the game, but maybe they can make an impact with 6 to 8 touches?
Well, Emery Simmons has had some big catches, and he's done some nice things. DJ Matthews, who I mentioned, is a guy that's got some big play capability. He's had the hamstring issue. He played a little bit against Rutgers. The week off you would think would help him, and hopefully he can be closer to 100%. Jalen Lucas is a true freshman from the New Orleans area that's been, when he's touched the ball, I think he's averaging 30 yards on kickoff return. He's the one that took the kickback against Rutgers. Against Nebraska, he was the leading rusher in the game for IU, and he had 3 carries. But they were for 39 yards. But that shows you where the running game is when your leading rusher is going for 39 yards. But he's not very big, like 5'10", 170-something pounds, but really quick, really fast, can make guys miss in space and take it the distance as well. So those are the guys. Anderson Kobe, he's a transfer. He was at Tennessee, he was at JUCO, then went to Tennessee, and now is here. He's got some big play capability, but he's been really inconsistent. But the guys I would look to are Matthews and Lucas, and then Josh Henderson, the transfer from North Carolina, has really, honestly, probably been the best back on the team. Shriver starts, but Henderson's really been good in the pass game and the run game, and I think he's got 3 touchdown receptions, which might lead the team, and he's done a nice job. I don't know if I'd call him a huge big play explosive guy, but he's had some significant chunk yardage at times.
You mentioned Casey and it clicking for him at linebacker and him stepping up. I can see he's filled that stat sheet. But in terms of game records, this is a Penn State team that turned the ball over 4 times against a very talented Ohio State defense. We're curious if they can play clean football. If there's someone that can disrupt that and cause them not to play clean football, who are we looking at in this Hoosiers defense?
I'd say probably the first guy is Deshaun McCullough. He's a true freshman, the highest rated recruit in Indiana history. His dad is Dylan, who was on the staff and left to go to Notre Dame. Before that was with the Chiefs when they won the Super Bowl and went to the Super Bowl a couple years in a row. He's 6'5", 235, 40 pounds. Just the kind of guy that you guys are probably used to in Ohio State and Michigan. At Indiana, they don't come along very often. Just a kind of a freak, you played receiver in high school, played safety. He's more of a kind of a DN / outside linebacker at Indiana. He plays, they call it the bull position, which is like a stand-up DN. And he is athletic and long. He's a true freshman, and teams have started to scheme around him and notice him. But he's a guy that can make some plays and get in the backfield. I'd say Casey, they've been using him on blitzes a lot. Trying to, and that's the thing that they don't do well defensively. They don't rush the passer. So they've got to take chances and they've got to blitz. But when you do that, you put guys on an island, and then you got a man-on-man coverage. It's a guy like Parker Washington, and that could be trouble. They've got DBs who have had some, good play in their careers, but they're not playing well this year. And Tywan Mullen and Jalen Williams and some other guys. So if they don't get home to the quarterback, the big plays are going to happen.
Before we get to your final thoughts on this matchup, let's go big picture. We got an early look at what was going to be a very special season for Indiana in 2020, but then you look at the story since then, leaves a lot to be desired. I think it's 1 conference victory since 2020. Yeah. What are the genuine vibes around this team in Bloomington and the thoughts about the leadership and the direction that things are heading? Because I'm sure in 2020, there was a lot of investment.
Yeah, let's be honest. You guys have probably – it's just flip-flopped. There's a lot of pressure on a James Franklin as a head football coach at Penn State, whereas the basketball coach maybe doesn't feel as much heat when you don't have as much success. Here at Indiana, it's the other way. The basketball coach has a ton of pressure, obviously, and the football coach not as much. But there's a lot of unrest. There's a lot of people who are unhappy, and it's – you talked about the 2020 season and last year. It's not like there was a slow, gradual decline. It was a complete, like you pushed a car off a cliff. They went from 6-2, and I think at one point in 20, they were top 10 to 15 in the country. They were undefeated, and 2-10 last year. Just brutal. No Big Ten wins. And then obviously you got the one this year, and it's looking like you could go 1-17 over a 2-year span. The problem Indiana has, and I actually pulled it up, the buyout for Tom Allen on December 22nd drops to $25.5 million. It drops to that. So, wow. And Indiana, last year, he changed his OC. They made him pay for that out of his own pocket. He had to come up with the money himself. They wouldn't even pay for him to change it. And it was less than $1 million. So
they're not going to be motivated to swallow that.
Not going to be. It would be shocking if there was a coaching change in Indiana in the near future. I think he's got at least 1 year, unless you can get him to do a Paul Chryst and agree to some kind of reduced buyout. But even then, it's going to be pretty high. and I'm not saying he should be fired. I'm just saying if anybody's thinking along those lines, I think it's right now far-fetched. I think Indiana and Tom Allen are joined at the hip for at least one more season, and I think the smart money is maybe two, unless somehow, he just decides it's not for him and he wants to take a reduced buyout and move on and go be a DC somewhere. But there is an unrest as much as you're going to have with Indiana's fan base, where right now everybody's focused on a team that's ranked 13th in the country in basketball, and the season starts next Tuesday. That's what most fans are focused on. The football fans are unhappy, but it's a small lot, to be perfectly honest.
All right. Well, this Saturday, this version of Indiana football, what do you anticipate against Penn State? Which way are you leaning? If you're comfortable enough, we'd love to hear a score prediction.
Yeah. Oh, no problem. Well, one thing that'll be interesting is the weather could be a factor. I heard today when I was driving my daughter to school, possible rain and wind gusts of maybe 40 to 50 miles an hour. Obviously now Penn State is the good running team. So that definitely, Indiana would be the passing team. So that affects Indiana probably more negatively than not that Penn State doesn't throw the ball, but, they have those great freshman running backs, and that's how they kind of make their hay. So, I think if the weather is a factor, I think it probably pulls the scoring down a little bit. I thought this would be, I think Penn State's 14-point favorite, if I'm not mistaken. I think that's what I saw. I will say 27-10 Penn State. And I think, one reason that if the weather is a factor, that probably, like I said, pulls the scoring down a little bit. But I think they win this. I think defensively they'll give Indiana a lot of problems, especially up front. And then offensively, I think, as the game goes on, they'll wear them down and pull away. I mean, maybe it's competitive for a quarter and a half. But I think Penn State eventually pulls away in this game and wins it by a couple touchdowns to maybe 3 scores.
Always great to get our 24/7 sports colleagues on here. Matt Weaver does a great job covering this Hoosiers football squad. Basketball season upcoming. I know things are about to shift into high gear there, so we appreciate the time. And you'll be sharing the press box with a couple of our colleagues, Mark Brennan and Daniel Gallen, this Saturday. So we'll talk to you soon. Let's keep it going here on the Lions247 Podcast and shift focus back to these Nittany Lions. We got a lot to discuss. A lot that we'll be watching ahead of this kickoff in Bloomington, Indiana. Daniel Gallen and Mark Brennan will both be in Memorial Stadium for the matchup. I will be here in our Happy Valley headquarters, and we'll be ready to break things down on another podcast afterward. But it's now time for that pregame conversation, fellas. And we always start that with what we learned on the practice field, and we had a lot to look for on Wednesday evening. We had our VIP observation notes up, a bunch of photos up. Some commentary up on the site, Lions247.com, as we always do on Wednesday night. But, Mark, one thing we were looking for was any indication of where things might stand at quarterback, whether from what we saw or heard from James Franklin. Didn't get that kind of clarity. Franklin said if he has anything formal to say on the matter, it'll happen after the matchup in Indiana. So if that happens, you guys will both be ready with your microphones. But offensive line is where the storyline really surfaced for me on Wednesday and what we might be looking at brewing in Bloomington.
Yeah, I mean, listen, we're only there for what, 10, 12, however many minutes. So we can only see what we see or don't see. And the number of people who weren't there when we were there was kind of stunning. I mean, it almost looked like an NFL offensive line in terms of the number of guys they actually dressed for games. I mean, the groupings were very, very small. So I think they're very fortunate that they were able to get a guy like Hunter Norzad from the transfer portal. I think it highlights the need to get one, if not two, quality offensive linemen from that portal every single year. I'm not sure what's happening in that room, but we've seen guys in slings, multiple guys in slings down the depth chart. Landon Tangwell, it sure seemed like he wasn't moving his left arm at all when we saw him on the sideline at the Ohio State game. So that looks like it's something that's going to be long lasting. So that's going to be an area, quarterback is obviously first and foremost when we're at Memorial Stadium for pregame, keeping an eye on what's going on, but seeing who's available, who's not available for that offensive line is going to be key, especially if it's nasty weather. Because, that may indicate that they're going to need to run the ball more. And, you might be able to get away with some things in the passing game when it comes to blocking. But if you have to really get in there and grind it out, it's going to be key to have as many of your top players as you can possibly have on that line.
We'll talk about Tengwall, Norzad, and those guard spots in a second. But Daniel, it's hard not to focus your attention on the left tackle position. Part of that is because everyone's focused on that position with this Penn State team right now. Olu Fashanu, it looks like he may be offensive tackle number 1 on the 2023 board. Well, hello there after 9 career starts. We'll find out where it goes. And part of that is going to be what's his availability look like moving forward to build on this momentum. It's very important for Penn State, obviously, to have their left tackle in the lineup. And he was not on the practice field in the portion that we saw on Wednesday. He did not finish the matchup against Ohio State. I think he missed the last 5 or 6 snaps overall offensively. That meant we saw Jimmy Chris get involved. Bryce Effner stayed at tackle as well. I'm looking long-term here. If Olu is not available, how might that equate to what we see from the tackle position? And you've got to factor in that Caden Wallace, not quite evident yet that he is a full go participant. So you factor those things together and you start to wonder who's going to be on the edge of this thing against Indiana.
To start with Caden Wallace, we saw kind of what we saw last week in terms of him being the partial participant is how we worded it in terms of in uniform out on the practice field, going through a couple different things. He was in uniform Saturday against Ohio State and didn't play. But yeah, I mean, you look at it between Caden Wallace and Olu Fashanu, Penn State could be down their starting tackles. And I think that Olu's availability is really big because, you need to protect your quarterback's blind side. I think that for the most part this year, Sean Clifford hasn't had to worry about pressure coming from that blind side. It feels like most of the memorable sacks that he's taken where a guy has just been beat has been off the right side in front of him. So I think if Penn State has Olu, it obviously elevates the level of this offensive line. There's a reason that he's being considered OT1 by certain draft analysts. There's a reason why there were clips of him being passed around on social media in the aftermath of that Ohio State matchup. I mean, there's a reason he's been getting all this praise, and I think he's lived up to that, in what we've seen this year. And anytime you take that caliber of player away from an offensive line, it makes things difficult. Even if Caden Wallace was healthy, even if they had their full complement of offensive tackles, all the depth in the world, you still take away a guy at that level. It's nearly impossible to replace that. So I think that that'll be the one position on the offensive line that, we're really going to be watching, and that I think during warmups we're really going to have an eye on when we get to Saturday.
Yeah, Tyler, one thing about Olu, I mean, I was down there on the field at the end of the Ohio State game, and he walked within 2 feet of me as he was leaving the field. He was with a trainer. He was walking gingerly, but under his own power. So make of that what you will. He didn't need assistance. He looked like a guy who was in a little bit of pain, but it wasn't anything excruciating. And he was, again, nobody made any effort to kind of help him. And they would if he needed help. I don't mean that to come across the wrong way, but he walked right by me and it didn't look like it was significant. So again, take that for what it's worth. They don't talk about injuries, but that's a little bit of intel from me being down on the field.
Yeah, the first step forward for him would be to be out there pregame warmups, getting those early stretches, some of that early work in with some position coaches. The next step would be for him to resurface from the locker room in that full uniform and start going through those pregame drills with the starting offensive unit. When that happens or when that doesn't happen, Daniel and Mark will have eyes on it. They have the binoculars in the press box at Memorial Stadium. So make sure you're following early at Lions247.com. It's not just the offensive line, of course. Folks want to know what's going on at quarterback, but whoever's protecting that quarterback, it's going to be in play here. And if Olu, for the sake of this conversation, is sidelined this Saturday, what does that do for you at the tackle position? I think we've got to acknowledge that if Bryce Effner is available for this one, if Caden Wallace is not available for this one, you'd imagine they'd want to keep Bryce Effner entrenched at the right side. And I think that lends you to think that Drew Shelton would be the next man up at tackle. I know Jimmy Chris was the next guy in at that situation late in the game. They moved Effner to the left side. Again, it was 4 or 5 snaps. I think if you've got a game plan here and you know what direction you need to work in, Drew Shelton, it sounds like he's a guy that would have already burned his red shirt if they were in a position where they needed him to. There's no hesitancy with this staff right now. They want to preserve the red shirt, but there's no hesitancy, it sounds, to trust him in a game. So they're trying to do that balancing act. He's got 2 games to his credit. This may be a spot start for him, and then you try to tuck him away for the rest of the way and maybe save a bowl game to him. But Drew Shelton could very quickly go in that spotlight. You could have these 2 freshman Drews, both top 24/7 prospects, front and center in this matchup, and it could expose a lot about your young talent.
Yeah, we were hearing in the preseason that Drew Shelton was as advanced in terms of offensive line fundamentals and skills as a freshman as they've ever had under James Franklin here. So that's really saying something. My early indication, I thought we were going to actually see more of him as the season went along, but they made the decision to try to redshirt him, which, it kind of makes sense to me, but it kind of doesn't. And the reason I say that is because if he's that technically advanced, I mean, are you really looking at him being a 5-year guy? I mean, if he's that good, we're already talking about Olu with 9 games. Olu, if he's banged up and can't play, I mean, he's going to be a guy who started 10 games and ends up being a first-round draft pick. I mean, it's incredible.
It's a good point, Mark. It's a good point, but where would you use, I guess, if you're trying to maximize that value of burning the red shirt?
Yeah,
is getting him on field goal unit or getting him 5% of the snaps overall in the season at left tackle enough? You do have this franchise left tackle in your possession right now. So I understand your point, but unless you're going to find a way to thrust him into that right tackle conversation midseason or get him reps on the interior, I don't really know if there's a pathway where the Penn State staff could see this makes sense. And I guess you never know what could happen along the way, but you're right. I mean, guys like him with this pedigree of that prospect ranking who come in and you hear this stuff about them early, they're usually not on campus for 5 years. Yeah,
but my argument would be that right tackle has been an issue for you almost the entire season, right? No matter if it's been Effner or no matter if it's been Caden Wallace. I mean, it really showed itself in the Ohio State game. And I'm not suggesting that Drew Shelton would have been in there and been the answer against Ohio State. But what I am saying is they showed enough flexibility with Effner that he's able to play guard and go in there and rotate with players at guard. And with Norzad missing a couple games and now Tangwell, I mean, that's where I thought maybe, and again, hindsight's 20/20. And if they have to use Shelton this week, they have to use him. But the whole concept of attempting to redshirt guys who you think have the ability to be elite players just isn't kind of just in this new world of college football that we're in, just doesn't seem to make a whole heck of a lot of sense. Again, I mean, you look at Olu and, here's a guy who's going to be a 1-year starter, and I'll be shocked if he doesn't enter the draft. And we would have never thought that. And this wasn't a guy who was superior from the technical standpoint as a true freshman. And that's the things that we were hearing about Drew Shelton. But if he does have to play, and listen, we hope everybody's healthy, but that's going to be a fun thing to watch. Let's see what this kid is really all about in a game situation. Again, I hope everybody's healthy. I hope everybody can play for both teams. That's not saying that as a homer, but if he is forced into action, it's going to be interesting to see how good this kid really is and how much those technical skills kind of come into play, because he's not the biggest guy yet. I mean, I think he's up to 285, 290, something like that. And I think his ceiling will probably be one of those 305 guys. But it's fascinating to me that you could look at running backs and they could come in and make an immediate impact. But when you have an opportunity to see a young offensive lineman, it's cool to kind of keep your focus on them and see what makes them special at this level.
Yeah, to get a start in game number 9 of your freshman season at left tackle for a program like Penn State would certainly be a big early step and a big spotlight on a young player. We'll see where it goes with that. And you mentioned a good point there. Bryce Effner, typically he's a guy we've seen play both guard positions. Hunter Norzad has really carried that load at left guard with Landon Tengwall out of play. We thought maybe JB Nelson would cut into that. That hasn't been the case. On the right side, the other question mark we came away from the practice field was no Salim Wormley during our glimpse at practice. And I need to make sure I mention a few things here. He did come back and play a complete game at right guard against Ohio State after being limited in some capacity in his snap totals against Minnesota. He was out of that game for an extended period. He played the entire game against Ohio State. He was on a call with us that they set up on Tuesday. So if something happened to him injury related, I don't think it's something coming out of the last game. So just be aware of that. And sometimes there's scheduling conflicts, but not seeing Wormley out there. Once again, it's him, Scruggs, and Fashanu have played about 98% of the snaps for this offense on the year. And when we're talking about two of those guys not being at the practice a few days before kickoff, it's going to raise some flags. And then you throw in some other depth concerns with Tangwall and Wallace, both lingering, not knowing what's going on there. But I think that's enough on the offensive line. Let's get over to the quarterback position because it's Drew Aller, it's Sean Clifford, and it's a continued evaluation process in which we've yet to hear any kind of final stamp on who the starting quarterback is. And it's strange that we are to the point now where you've got to check in on that because Sean Clifford has started 25 of these in a row for the Penn State Nittany Lions. And aside from a brief moment in time in November 2020, when he was pulled out in a game on the road in Nebraska and kept out for a start against Iowa the following week. By the way, he was the starting quarterback again for this team by halftime of that Iowa matchup. We haven't seen this from Sean Clifford where it's been hanging in the air. And Daniel, what did you make of our interactions with James Franklin yesterday? What we heard today from J1 Sider, who's not just a running backs coach, but a co-offensive coordinator, and some feedback from players such as Brennan Strange yesterday, pretty open that this is an ongoing dialogue. I don't think there's any secret right now.
I mean, James Franklin has had the chance to shut it down pretty much. This talk about who's going to start on Saturday or who's going to play how much. He's had the opportunity to be definitive in one way or the other, and he hasn't yet. So that leaves the space for us to read between the lines, and we'll know for sure on Saturday. But I do think it is interesting that the door is left open with where we are right now. There hasn't been anything definitive in one way or the other, and I think that we've been hearing good things about Drew Aller this week from some of the players and the coaches. I do think that some of the things that we've heard have kind of tracked with what we were hearing earlier in the year in terms of he's become more vocal. He's become more authoritative. He's found his voice. I think that's what Parker Washington was talking about last night. But I thought J1 Sider's comments to us earlier Thursday were really interesting. He said that Drew Aller doesn't flinch when he's in the game, that they throw things at him in practice that he might not even see in a game in terms of causing chaos, making things difficult, and he just rises to the occasion. And Sider said that when he goes out there, it looks like the games are easier for him than practice, which is their whole goal. So I thought that was interesting. And Sider did come back around and give a pretty big compliment to Sean Clifford and the job that he's done in bringing Aller and the rest of the young quarterbacks along in that role as the 6th-year senior. So there's been good feedback on what we've heard about Aller as a player. I think that you can kind of, given all the things we've heard, you can really track his development in terms of like the physical tools, I think have been apparent since he's gotten here. And then, he's developed on the vocal side and the mental side during his time up to this point. But I mean, I think that it is interesting. I mean, it's left, James Franklin has kind of left a little bit of a vacuum here. And he's someone that I think we usually give him credit as someone who knows what he's doing with what he says publicly and how he presents things. So it's just, it's made things interesting for a November game against one of the, between a team that's out of contention for the most part in the Big Ten East and one of the worst teams in the conference in November. So, I mean, I'm looking forward to Saturday to finally get an answer once and for all.
Mark, with James Franklin, this is a situation where midseason quarterback changes are not his MO as Penn State head coach, of course. And Trace McSorley had the job for so long. I remember that road matchup in 2018 where it seemed like maybe Trace McSorley should have stayed on the sidelines because of where he was medically. He still started that game. You think about Sean Clifford. and in that spiral in November. And this was a topic of conversation, and Will Levis got his one opportunity, but it was quickly back to Sean Clifford after that. And in that instance, James Franklin even referenced, he said, I played college quarterback. I know what it's like to feel like you're one mistake away from losing your job, and I don't want my starter to feel that way. And I think he's done a tremendous job publicly over the course of Sean's roller coaster career of doing that, deflecting for him in times, and being his biggest cheerleader in moments where maybe it didn't seem like that was the move for James Franklin to make. Right now, though, it's a different approach for him. And I'm curious, you've seen Franklin hit some inflection points during his 9 years on campus. Yeah. What do you make of the way November starts and the decision that looms here? And Sean Clifford, the good soldier who's down to 4 or 5 games of eligibility, and Drew Aller, who a lot of people want to see hand the keys to the car to this young man.
I'm fascinated by the way Franklin is handling this publicly, because I think the three of us kind of know from experience that he's not the kind of coach who's going to go in front of the media and just lie. He takes a lot of pride in being as honest as you can be. I mean, because, clearly you can't just say everything, tell everybody everything, but he is not the guy who would go in there and say Sean Clifford is the starting quarterback and then not start Clifford. That's not his MO. So what do we make of what we're hearing this week? He is not saying Sean Clifford. He is bending over backward not to making an announcement. So is that James Franklin being honest for if he does start Aller, that he can go back and say, well, I never said Clifford was going to be the starter? Or is that James Franklin exercising gamesmanship for Indiana, just not wanting to put it out there? So I can't get a great read on it. My gut feeling is that it's the latter. And I don't think there's anything wrong with that whatsoever, by the way. I don't think there's anything wrong whatsoever. I would think it was wrong if he came out and said, yes, it's status quo. Sean Clifford is going to be our starter, and then he starts Aller. I don't think that would be right, but that's not what he's doing. And he's very good at working those margins with the media. And I'm not being critical. I think it's a positive thing, because if we don't have a great feel for it, you could be sure that Tom Allen doesn't have a great feel for it. So my gut feeling, and I'm not sure how you guys feel about this, is that I think it's going to be Clifford. That's my gut feeling. But I do not know that for sure. And I think I could read this guy pretty well. But I don't know which one of those things it is. We will find out, obviously, Friday or Saturday. I'm sorry.
If you find out Friday, let us know.
If I find out Friday, I'll let everybody know. But I mean, it's. I don't know if you guys have found that interesting this week, but the way he's kind of danced around this, I think has been pretty interesting and fascinating to watch as somebody who's covered him, for these 9 years now, or 8 years, whatever the hell it is.
I've got one quick Franklin anecdote in terms of making a mid-season quarterback change. I mean, in 2010, when he was the offensive coordinator at Maryland, they started Jamar Robinson for the first 3 games, and then turned to Danny O'Brien, who is on staff now, I think in the 4th game of the season. And he came in, and Franklin, as Franklin pointed out at one point last year, when he was asked about Danny O'Brien, he coached him to ACC Rookie of the Year performance. So this isn't necessarily new territory. And Franklin cited Danny O'Brien as someone that he talked to this week. And O'Brien, obviously in 2010 he was the one who was put into the starting lineup. And then 2011, when Randy Edsall came in, O'Brien was part of this weird back and forth with CJ Brown at quarterback. So there are some resources there. And in terms of, making this midseason switch and sticking with it, it is in Franklin's history a little bit. So I'm glad I could put my Maryland diploma to good use on this podcast.
It's a tangled web when you talk about quarterbacks and decisions like this, and we'll see where it goes. We're going to have a lot to discuss on Saturday night, that's for sure, coming out of this matchup, and we'll do that. But let's get to some other players that we want to keep focus on. We've covered good ground, the offensive line and the quarterback, and let's talk about this matchup versus Indiana for Penn State. Actually, before the players, just generally, concerns, strengths when you review this matchup. Daniel, starting with you, This is a matchup against an Indiana team, as we just heard from a guy who covers them closely. They are struggling. They are desperate. That's not always a good team to face, but quite frankly, it's the kind of team that you should be able to steamroll from a talent perspective if you bring your right game to Bloomington as a Penn State squad.
One thing that stands out to me, and I'll get into it with my prediction and bold prediction a little bit later, is that Penn State is going to have a lot of opportunities on offense. Indiana is running, a ton of plays this year. They're number 4 nationally, yet they are number 109 in points per play. So they're running a lot of plays and running them very inefficiently. So I think that's something to watch. I think that Penn State is going to have, the ball a lot. I'm not too worried about the defense, having a hangover performance. I think that those guys will be there and they'll be ready to play. They're going to get the offense the ball, and it's going to be, what does the offense do with it? How does the offense take advantage of all of these extra possessions, excuse me, that they might not have had in the past. So I think going through and looking at some of the numbers, that's the number one thing that stands out to me.
Mark, how about you? I mean, this is a Penn State team that dominates the series all time, 23-2 against Indiana. We know better than that based on recent history, but that 2020 season, that may have been special for Indiana, 6-2 in the Big Ten. They're 1-13 in conference play since then. This is a game that James Franklin, Penn State, they certainly can't afford to lose. And I think from a get-right perspective in November, you want to go and you want to look like a team that has authority out there.
Yeah, I mean, what have we seen from this Penn State defense? What kind of teams give it trouble? And it's teams that complete a very high percentage of their passes. Ohio State and Michigan are both in the top 4 in the NCAA, over 70% completion rate. Indiana's at 55%. So we saw against Minnesota, we saw against Auburn what Manny Diaz's defense can do. The thing about Minnesota and Auburn is both of those teams had legit ground games at the time that they were played. Indiana is ranked, 128 in the nation in rushing yards per game. So this isn't a one-dimensional offense. It's a no-dimensional offense. And I can't understand how they could possibly score enough points to be in a game with Penn State. I think it all boils
turnovers
down to well, that's
turnovers
exactly.
and I mean, the weather forecast is early, but it could be wet, it could be windy. I guess those are the kind of things that you look out for.
And then who do you look out for them with to first and foremost coming out of that Ohio State game? But I think fortunately for Penn State fans, Sean Clifford's typically been good turnover-wise against this sort of opponent. So you really need those running backs to hold on to the rock. We saw in a bad weather game at Northwestern that they could not do that. So if it is a bad weather game, you need those guys to learn from that. And you need Sean Clifford to do what he does in most games, not against elite competition. And that's if he's playing. If it's Aller, it's the same thing. So, yeah, you hit on it perfectly that if Penn State does what it's supposed to do and comes out in the right mental state, the right frame of mind coming off of that tough loss, there's no reason this shouldn't be a relatively easy win. Now, those are two big ifs. I mean, we've seen in games where they have turned it over, and we've seen Sean Clifford implode at times, but I don't get the sense that that's going to happen. I love the way that this team bounced back against Minnesota. I said early in the year, the key for this team at some point along the way was going to be resiliency, the ability to bounce back that it did not show in 2020, that it did not show in 2021. So we saw it against Minnesota after Michigan. Still a lot to play for at that point. I think there's still a lot to play for, not the same amount, but you can still get to that New Year's 6. You can still get to 10 wins, which would be something after having 11 over the last 2 seasons. So I just think when you look at the way this thing kind of presents itself from both sides, I would be surprised if Penn State doesn't win rather easily.
All right, Daniel, players to watch here for Penn State. I don't think either of us need to mention Sean Clifford, Drew Aller, or Olu Fashanu after our recent conversation. But where do you land offensively, defensively, and in a matchup where there are so many individual matchups that you love from a Penn State angle?
I want to see what Parker Washington can do as an encore after last week. That was his best game of the year. He was 11 catches, 179 yards, and a touchdown. It was he'd been leading the team in catches and yards, but we hadn't seen that kind of, I guess, electricity from him. So I want to see if he can follow that up, no matter who the quarterback is. We talked about that performance last week, potentially being a springboard for him down the stretch. And he's another guy who, depending how this last month of the season goes, could have some decisions to make this offseason about his future. So I'll see how he kicks off this final third of the year. I'm curious about that. And then defensively, I think I'll go with Tyler Elsdon at middle linebacker. That spot has been, not the best. I think it's been overshadowed, by Curtis Jacobs and Abdul Carter. But if this is a game where the Penn State defense can really exert itself over Indiana, I want to see what Elsdon can do there in the middle. I think that the athleticism at that spot between him and Kobe King, we've seen them got a couple times across the middle, but I think Elsdon is one of the more underrated tone setters on the team in terms of watching how physical he plays. And I think back to that Minnesota game where he was really hitting hard, really playing downhill. And I'm curious to see what it looks like in this rebound performance.
I know it's not always about the stats, but when you're playing middle linebacker for Penn State, people want to take a look at those tackle totals. And Elsdon's essentially doubling up Kobe King on a weekly basis at this point. He has collected fewer than 4 solo tackles in 5 consecutive games. So that's something that just stands out to me. I think you want to see an uptick there for Elsdon, and a good opportunity for him, and it would go a long way. Mark, what do you got for us?
I'm going to go out on a limb and say Nick Singleton. I think this is the kind of opponent that he will be able to get to the edge against. I think there's a lot of focus on Kaytron Allen, and with good reason, because he's played extremely well. But if this is a little bit of a weather game and they do count on the running game, I think the more opportunities that Singleton gets, the more that the odds just work that he is going to pop something, 50, 60, 70 type yards. So I wouldn't be surprised if he has a big run or two. And over on defense, I will foreshadow my bold prediction slightly by going with Chop Robinson. I think it's time for these guys these defensive ends to kind of let it be known that they're more about just pressuring the quarterback. They have to start building up some sacks. So that's kind of foreshadowing my bold prediction.
All right, I'll stick in the offensive backfield for my offensive pick, and I'll go with Kaytron Allen because just quickly going back to what these guys did at Ohio State, went through the numbers a little bit yesterday. We were so focused on what happened at the end of that game that you got to take a few days and remember what else happened. 121 yards on 26 rush attempts for those two freshmen. Kaytron Allen led the way. What they did on the ground with running backs against Ohio State in the past, 42 yards on 19 carries in 2021, 36 yards on 8 carries in 2020, 2019 with Journey Brown, 65 yards on 12 carries, 2018 with Miles Sanders, 43 yards on 16 carries, and 2017 with Saquon Barkley, 44 yards on 21 carries. So let me go back to that. 121 yards on 26 carries. That sounds a lot better, doesn't it? So signs of encouragement. And to me, Kaytron Allen has been the steadier of the two. He got the start last week. It sounds like they're going to rotate that role because Jaywan Slater wants it to reflect that they are both co-starters. And to me, in a matchup like this, particularly if it ends up being a bit of a wet track out there, I love the thought of giving Kaytron Allen an opportunity to be that 20 carry kind of a guy. This may be a game like Northwestern that both of these guys get in that 20 carry range, and there's an opportunity for both of them to go 100 plus yards. But I'll hang my hat on Kaytron Allen having the higher impact day, but I could see, to your point, Nick Singleton going 70 on one play and really changing his stat sheet around. And by the way, the next touchdown that Singleton scores will tie the record for freshman rushing touchdowns in a Penn State uniform. Noah Cain had 8 of those in 2019. Defensively, Adiza Isaac, because I was thinking Chop Robinson, but to the same effect, this is a game where you think the opponent is going to be passing the ball quite a bit. You're going to have a superior advantage with your defensive secondary against the playmakers that Indiana is going to put on this perimeter. So if we don't see it happen in this game, I'm going to be pretty doubtful that we're going to see that explosion, that kind of an uptick in the sack numbers, in the pressure numbers down the stretch of this matchup. And it will be a really good sign before you go up against the Maryland team that does have a potent passing attack and does have a pretty electric quarterback when he's on. So I think that's worth watching. And since you went with Robinson, I'll go with who I think is their second biggest threat in terms of guy who's going to get a bunch of snaps off the edge. And Adisa Isaac is my pick there. Then Dennis Sutton in week 8 remains the only defensive lineman on this roster with multiple sacks, guys.
Yeah,
right,
it's
let's
crazy.
Let's get into our predictions.
Yeah, lead into me. That's a perfect segue to me for my predictions. I'm taking over the show. I'm taking over the show right now.
Have at it.
Now, listen, just Tyler, seriously, building on what you just got done saying. I mean, you pointed this out earlier in the week, and it's kind of stunning to think that we're this far into the season and Adisa Isaac and Chop Robinson have combined for 2 sacks. I mean, that's almost you almost have to take a second look at that. And is that really the case? And yeah, sure enough, it is really the case. So my bold prediction is that Adisa Isaac and Chop Robinson will combine to double their sack numbers for the season. The two of them somehow will come out of this game with 4. Whether it's one guy has 3 and one guy has 1, or 2 guys have 2, or one guy has 4. Somehow those 2 guys are going to combine, I think, for 4 sacks.
Mark, that's like quadrupling their total. I mean, they've got 2 combined at this point. Doubling their total would just be 2 on the day.
No,
they've only got 2 combined sacks through 8 games.
Right. So I'm saying 4 total between them.
Oh, I thought you were saying they're gonna get double in this game alone.
Yes,
oh, okay.
I think
I thought you said they doubled their season total.
No,
gotcha.
They would double. Does that make sense to you, Daniel?
It does now.
Okay.
Yeah,
everybody. That's just why I should never take over the show, because I confuse myself, and now I'm.
Well, I'll tell you what. If that happens, Mark, then that answers a lot of questions that I just talked about in this pass rush. If those 2 combined for 4 sacks plus in this game, so good call. This was a matchup where Shaka Tony. Hey, this is where Shaka Tony would always show up with a crazy sack number against Indiana. Maybe someone takes that mantle this year. Well, prediction-wise, from a score perspective, before we go off the rails here, Mark, what do you got?
I got it 35-10. I think Penn State wins relatively handily. Again, I just don't see where this Indiana offense is going to be able to generate a lot of points, especially if the weather's bad. I think the defense played really well for most of the game against Ohio State. And again, one-dimensional offenses struggle against Manny Diaz. No-dimensional offenses are really going to have their hands full.
How about you, Daniel?
I think Tyler's Rutgers math education was shining through
Nice.
there. But so my bold prediction, I kind of laid it out earlier in terms of Indiana runs a lot of plays, doesn't do a lot with them. They're 3rd worst in time of possession this year, which would be fine if they were scoring a lot of points, which they aren't. So Penn State is going to have a lot of opportunities with the ball. So with my prediction, I think we're going to see multiple Drew Aller series before halftime. We've heard a lot about that second quarter series earlier in the non-conference slate. I think that, weather permitting, this is the perfect opportunity to get Aller out there. And I think they're going to have the chance to get the ball back a couple times in the first half, a couple more times than they usually have. So I think we'll see multiple Drew Aller series, and Penn State scores a touchdown on at least one of those. So that's where I'm at from bold prediction standpoint. And then in terms of score, I got Penn State 38, Indiana 10. Just in terms of looking how Indiana has played this year, some of their injuries, they have uncertainty at quarterback, and they don't have a 5-star that they're thinking about putting in. So I think that the Penn State defense is in really good shape to take care of business, give the offense plenty of opportunities, and it might not be pretty, but I think Penn State will have enough opportunities that they're going to score a lot of points against Indiana.
I mean, what kind of attitude does Penn State choose to show up into November with? I think that's ultimately everything, not just this Saturday, but for the course of this month. What kind of energy and effort are we going to see from this team? How much does it matter to them to keep winning games now that the biggest prize is off the table? And I think we'll see them show up. I could see a sluggish start potentially, but overall, I do think they'll prevail and they'll do it in a pretty emphatic way. I got 34-17, and I guess it's a narrow margin compared to you guys, but it still covers the spread, which at last check was over 2 touchdowns, but under 20 points. And with this matchup, I'm going to say Kaytron Allen and the ground ground game at large has a good game. I think we'll come out of this one too, because they'll have to scramble a bit in some way offensively up front. I think whatever they do, it's going to ultimately be a pretty good day for the offensive line. And we're going to come away saying the depth is better than it was last year, clearly, because they were able to overcome some things this week. And to this point, they've given up 12 sacks through 8 games. Last year, they gave up 34 sacks on the season. So to me, a big storyline coming out of this one might be another positive step forward for the way we view this offensive front and the ground game at large. In terms of the quarterback, that's going to tie into my bold prediction. I'm not going to predict the starter. I'm not going to tell you the starter is going to be. Mark's going to do that for us on Friday, like he said. But I'm going to say that both Drew Aller and Sean Clifford throw a touchdown pass in this matchup. So make of it what you will there. But I think it's time to see both these guys playing football with a game hanging in the balance. And maybe that doesn't last long. Maybe Penn State puts the pedal to the metal and they've got a huge lead and it's garbage time for Aller. But you need to see some extensive usage of the freshman quarterback, I think, one way or the other. And I think James Franklin, based on the way he is handling his approach, is conceding that fact, or kind of coming to grips with that fact that it's time to take that shift. And if we see Sean Clifford for 95% plus snaps, then wow, we were kind of misled, I guess, in our view of how this thing was shaken out over the course of the week. But we'll find out real soon, guys. 34-17 is my pick. You guys gave yours, and my bold prediction, like I said, a couple touchdowns from the different quarterbacks. That's it for this episode. We're back with a post-game podcast on Saturday. These guys will be out in Bloomington. I'll be here at home base, but we'll come to you with the latest of what we're hearing. And if there is a quarterback change, it will be our first opportunity to hear about it from James Franklin. So you won't want to miss that kind of conversation coming out of the matchup. A big thanks again to our guest, Matthew Weaver, for breaking down Indiana. I'm Tyler Donohue. This has been the Lions 247 Podcast.